Morning, thanks very much, Anne-Marie. Yes, I'm going to talk about the legal requirements for assessing severity in the context of animal experiments. In the context particularly of there's a new European directive on animal experiments which came into force in January this year. And so the UK legislation, Animal Scientific Procedures Act, has had to be amended quite significantly to bring it into line with the new directive. Before I get into the legal and nitty-gritty, however, I just want to talk about the ethics and how the ethics meshes with the law in this area, because ethics is actually much more interesting than the law. So there is a utilitarian ethical test at the heart of the legislation, and that's found in section 5B3D of the new Animal Scientific Procedures Act, or ASPA. And that says that in carrying out the evaluation of a programme of work, the Secretary of State, the Home Secretary, must, amongst other things, carry out a harm-benefit analysis of the programme of work to assess whether the harm that would be caused to protected animals in terms of suffering, pain and distress is justified by the expected outcome, taking into account ethical considerations. So the ethics is actually right there in the heart of the legislation, and the expected benefit to human beings, animals or the environment. When it says animals, it means, of course, other animals, not the animals that are experimented on. So that's a classic utilitarian, or a type of utilitarian cost-benefit analysis. I'm going to skip the next slide for a moment. But it's not the match is not a complete match between the law and between law and utilitarian ethics for two reasons. First of all, the law leaves out of account some types of harm which would be taken into account under a utilitarian calculus. So, for example, death. The fact that an animal dies, whether as a result of the experiment or because it's surplus requirements at the end of the experiment, the law ignores that. The law does not regard death as a harm, which is quite an interesting metaphysical concept, but the court in a BUAV case a few years ago said in the context of the legislation that death is not a harm, and for what it's worth, I think the court was probably right. Secondly, suffering below a certain threshold is left out of account as far as the law is concerned, suffering which is less than that caused by an injection or the equivalent. And thirdly, and this is particularly important, I think, the suffering of animals which are not actually used in experiments is left out of account. Now, if you think about it, a lot of animals are needed in the context of animal experiments, which are not actually used in the experiments themselves. For example, animals to breed. So a few years ago, the BUAV did an undercover investigation at Harlan, which is actually just up the road from here, which is an animal breeding company. And BUAV found, amongst other things, that some bitches were bred year after year in some pretty awful conditions, actually. But irrespective of the conditions, it's I think undisputed that dogs suffer from being in the laboratory environment. So those dogs breeding were needed so that the eventual hoped for benefit could materialize. But the law says that the suffering of those animals, because they're not actually used in the experiment itself, has to be left out of account. Again, in a utilitarian ethical calculus, you would take that suffering into account because it is part of the suffering which is needed to produce the eventual benefit. Then similarly, the law leaves out of account any benefits to the animals used in experiments. I may strike you as odd to talk about benefits for laboratory animals, but actually there are some benefits. For example, lab animals don't have to forage for their food. They get their food. A laboratory mouse doesn't have to worry about the neighbourhood cat. So there are some benefits that may be far outweighed by the disadvantage of being a laboratory animal, but again the law leaves out of account. You're not allowed to take into account any benefits you think a laboratory animal might receive. The law focuses purely on the harm. So a quick word about public opinion as far as severity is concerned. Not surprisingly, opinion polls show that it is the suffering of animals which most concerns the public. The greater the suffering, the greater the concern. So, for example, a YouGov poll commissioned by the BUAV in 2009 in 6, I think, fairly representative EU countries found that 84% of respondents, very even across all the different countries, wanted a ban on severe pain or distress for any animal. As we shall see, the 84% didn't get their wish, but that's what they said they wanted. There are similar percentages, slightly lower, wanted bans on any pain or suffering for primates, cats and dogs. And I'm sure there are many reasons why people focus in particular on the suffering of primates, cats and dogs, but I'm sure one of the reasons is that it's easier for us to identify with the suffering of primates, cats and dogs than it is with mice and rats, for example. So, onto the law itself. This is the new European Directive. And Article 36 requires that projects using animals must be authorised by a competent authority. Competent authority simply means essentially a government, member state government. This is new. It's not new in the UK, but it's new for many of the EU countries. Then Article 38 goes on to require a project evaluation, of which there are a number of elements. For example, harm-benefit test, cost-benefit test that I've mentioned. The 3 R's. Many of you, I guess, will know what the 3 R's is. It's the principle that you can't use animals in a particular way if the desired scientific information can be generated either without using animals or by using fewer animals than proposed, or by causing less suffering to those that are used. So that's the key part of the project evaluation. Severity has to be classified, and finally the project evaluation has to decide whether to assess the project retrospectively to see whether what was expected in terms of benefit, in terms of animal suffering, actually happened in practice. I'll come back to that a little bit later. So, classification of severity. Article 15.1 of the directive says that member states shall ensure that all procedures, the procedure essentially means an experiment. It may involve more than one individual thing done to an animal, but it's the experiment as a whole. But a project may involve a number of different procedures, but the focus for the directive is on procedures, on experiments. Member states shall ensure that all procedures are classified as non-recovery, mild, moderate, or severe on a case-by-case basis in accordance with Annex 8. I'll come back to that presently. Annex 8 itself says the severity of a procedure shall be determined by the degree of pain, suffering, distress, or lasting harm expected to be experienced by an individual animal during the course of the procedure. So I've very efficiently copied Annex 8. It's only 4 pages long, but I very inefficiently forgot to bring a stapler with me, so I'm going to do that during the break. But Annex 8 will be available to people afterwards. So, Annex 8 then sets out the factors to be taken into account when classifying. So, for example, it's based on, you choose the severity classification based on the most severe effects for an animal, after taking into account various measures which under the 3 R's procedure that I mentioned a moment ago, after various things are done to keep suffering to a minimum. And you often see in research products things which scientists call humane endpoints, which is the point at which an experiment has to stop because the suffering is not allowed to get any higher. So that would be part of the humane endpoint, would be something you take into account in deciding on the severity of the project. And the rest of this is pretty obvious really. You take into account the nature and intensity of the pain, suffering, distress or lasting harm, the duration, and that's important clearly because as we all know, pain is a function of both intensity but also duration. I probably would prefer to suffer severe pain for an hour than moderate pain for a day or a week. So pain involves both of those elements. Cumulative suffering, because a number of different techniques are done to animals, so you clearly should take into account the whole experience for the animal, the frequency of the procedures, and very importantly as well, prevention from expressing, extent to which an animal is prevented from expressing natural behaviour, including restrictions on housing, husbandry and care standards. This is really important because it's not, animals don't just suffer from the actual experiment, they may also suffer from the necessarily confined and restrictive way in which they're housed, even if the housing is done properly in accordance with codes of practice and so forth. And indeed, in relation to the undercover investigation which the BUAV did of neuroscience research on marmosets a few years ago now, David Morton, who, speaking later, who did a report for the Animals Procedure Committee, the then government statutory body, Professor Morton said that in his view the marmosets were suffering moderately, and we'll come to see what moderately means, simply from the way in which they were housed, so even before all the stuff that was done to their brains. It's a very important component to take into account. It's not just the actual experiment which matters for the animal. So there are definitions in Annex 8 of the various severity categories. So non-recovery means if an animal is subjected to an operation which has terminal anaesthesia, which means that it won't be allowed to recover. And it's obvious that provided the anaesthesia is done properly, which it isn't always, then, and the animal is killed before recovering, the animal is not going to suffer. But again, note that the animal may, of course, have suffered from the way it is housed and restrictions on natural behaviour, etc., prior to the actual surgery. And the mild definition, you can see there, says very little of interest. Moderate is slightly more interesting, and I've underlined long-lasting mild, and just to bring home the point that duration of suffering is important. So though the suffering may be mild, if it's long-lasting, then for the animal that converts it into moderate. And similarly with severe, if the pain, etc., is long-lasting moderate, then the long-lasting nature of it, whatever long-lasting means, something I'll come back to, converts what would otherwise be moderate suffering into severe suffering. When you get your Annex 8, you'll see various examples of mild. I've just given some examples here as an illustration. I'm not going to go through them all. I've underlined gavage. Gavage is where they stick a tube down an animal's throat to pump various substances into its stomach. And it can be very distressing for the animals and can cause injury from the physical process. So query whether gavage should necessarily be described as mild. And then the final bullet point, the accumulation of various procedures, underlining the point about cumulative suffering. And presumably what it means here is that these are procedures which the European Commission thinks would not otherwise even be mild, so below the lower threshold. But if you put them together, so depriving a rat, an adult rat, of food for 24 hours, etc., the accumulation can move it above threshold into the mild category. And then examples of moderate as well. So the first one, toxicity, poisoning tests for safety of drugs, safety of chemicals. A lot of surgery is put into the moderate category, interestingly, under general anaesthesia and appropriate analgesia. Some of these examples are, certainly in human terms, would be very major thoracotomy. In human terms is considered very major surgeries where they break open the ribs to get at the lungs and so forth. Craniotomies, they do the same to the skull to get at the brain. Orchidectomy is removal of testicles. Again, even with analgesia, query whether these really should be properly regarded as moderate. And I've also underlined organ transplantation with effective management of rejection. The next bullet point, irradiation or chemotherapy at a sublethal dose, so a dose that's not intended to kill the animal, or it is, but with reconstitution of the immune system, which enables the animal to fight infections. Adverse effects would be expected to be mild or moderate and would be short-lived, less than 5 days. Now, again, query anybody who's had anything to do with cancer might question whether that really should be described as moderate. Then we come on to severe, and again you'll see these in Annex 8 when I get around to stapling. So toxicity testing where death is the endpoint. So in other words, this is the notorious LD50 test, for example, which many of you will have heard of, where the actual intention of the experiment is to discover how many animals die from having a substance fed to it. Models with inductions of tumours that are expected to cause progressive lethal disease, so the animal is expected to die. For example, tumours causing cachexia, if that's how you say it, which is where the animal basically starves to death. It happens with humans as well, because because of the cancer, you're too ill to eat. Or tumours resulting in metastatic spreads to different parts of the body away from the primary tumour, and tumours that are allowed to ulcerate. Organ transplantation, this will resonate with Dan and Ange and Cage from their xenotransplantation work. This time, where organ rejection is likely to lead to severe distress or impairment of the general condition of the animals. Inescapable electric shock to produce learned helplessness, complete isolation for prolonged periods of social species, dogs are non-human primates, forced swim or exercise tests intended to cause the animal to suffer exhaustion. It's pretty heavy duty stuff. Now, maybe not all of these will necessarily be licensed in the UK, but clearly they are happening somewhere in the EU. Who is responsible for classification? Well, the member state, the government, essentially has to decide on classification. There's a dispute with the Home Office as to whether it's then the responsibility of the Home Office to make sure that the classification is actually kept to in practice. Home Office say it isn't, it's the researcher's responsibility. Others, including myself, say that that's wrong, and that the Home Office has the legal responsibility not just to assign the severity classification, but to ensure that it's kept in practice. And I'm not going to go through the legal argument now, but it would be a very odd result if responsibility was split. Home Office classifies, it's up to researchers whether they keep to it. The Home Office says they are going to keep to it in practice anyway, so it may be something of an academic debate, at least for the moment. There is an upper limit, or at least a notional upper limit, on the amount of suffering. Article 15.2 says, subject to the safeguard clause in Article 55.3, which I'll come to, member states shall ensure the procedure is not performed if it involves severe pain, suffering or distress that is likely to be long-lasting and cannot be ameliorated. It cannot be ameliorated, I think, essentially means cannot be reduced down to at least moderate. Problem is, what does long-lasting mean? There's no guidance from the European Commission, there's no guidance from the Home Office in the draft guidance which is recently published, which I think is a shame, because long-lasting can be interpreted very broadly. You could say, is it a few minutes, is it a few hours, a few days, a few months? I don't know. Someone somewhere will argue that long-lasting means, you know, if it's only a few months, then that's fine. So we need guidance. Article 53, which Article 15.2 is subject to, is the so-called safeguard clause, but this is not about safeguarding animals, this is about safeguarding researchers, gives an exception to that rule. So where the safeguard clause bites, where there are exceptional and scientifically justifiable reasons, whatever that means, a member state can allow severe pain, suffering or distress, even though it is long-lasting, and even though it cannot be ameliorated. Just to let you know, there are other severity schemes in New Zealand and Switzerland, for example. I'm not going to go into them this morning. Reuse is really important. In some circumstances, it's possible to reuse an animal in a different experiment, which obviously matters for the animal as far as accumulation of suffering is concerned. It's very important to understand what reuse means. Reuse means where you're using another animal where you could have used a different animal. So researchers reuse animals to keep numbers down, or more cynically to save money. Single or continued use, by contrast, means where, although you're doing a number of different things to an animal, you have to, for the purpose of the experiment, use that same animal. An example of single use came from the Cambridge undercover investigation, where 20 marmosets were trained on various discrimination tasks, training tasks, while confined in a small container. And if you look at the footage, it's clear that they were experiencing distress. They then had operations with 18 injections to 9 different locations on each side of the brain, more testing afterwards, and again, if you look at the footage, even more distress, not surprisingly, because of the brain damage, they were now unable to do what they had been able to do before. 5 to 11 months after the first operation, a dialysis probe was inserted in an operation lasting 8.5 hours, so really major surgery. And then after 7 to 10 days recovery, yet more testing. And that continued for 18 to 24 months before the animals were killed. Now, 2 points here. First of all, the Home Office categorised all that single use as moderate, and the Court of Appeal, in a subsequent judicial review, said that it was entitled to. The second point is that this is all single use. This is not reuse of an animal, this is all single use. So if we then come to what the directive says, Article 16 says generally, the general rule is that you can only reuse an animal if, and there are a number of conditions which you can see there, but the important ones are the actual severity of the previous experiment was mild or moderate, and that the further procedure is no more than moderate. But given what moderate can involve from a single use, that may not be a whole lot of comfort to the animal, and reuse can be repeated. And there is an exception even to that. A competent authority, government may allow reuse of the one procedure allowing severe pain or distress. So even though the animal has experienced severe, we've seen examples of what severe means. In exceptional circumstances of a scientific justification, member states can authorise the animal to be reused in moderate. We've seen what moderate can mean, and that repetition can then be, the reuse can then be repeated. So reuse really important. There is draft guidance issued by the Home Office. I think it's still draft, Judy. I don't think it's been published yet. It says very little actually about severity, which I think is a shame because there are a lot of questions. It does say that severity classification should be treated as a limit to be approached only when absolutely necessary. So a researcher who has a moderate severity limit, for example, shouldn't go to the borderline between moderate and severe unless he or she has to. And again, these concepts are very vague, so how much comfort that is to an animal is questionable. Very important principle in the legislation that whatever suffering is allowed, whatever you're allowed to do to an animal, you have a duty to minimise suffering. That's partly through the refinement limb of the 3 R's principle, partly through licence conditions. It's an obvious point, but minimise is not the same as minimal. When people say we have to minimise suffering, it sounds quite reassuring, doesn't it? But in fact, minimised suffering can still be very high if actually there's very little that you can do to reduce the suffering because of the nature of the experiment. So because of the duty to minimise suffering, it's really important that suffering is evaluated properly and that suffering, different elements of suffering are properly taken into account. Because if you don't evaluate properly or take things properly into account, you're not, in practice, you're not going to be able to minimise properly. So, the correct approach to severity assessment, in my opinion, and I'll say at the outset, it's not easy. What we're dealing with is, almost by definition, is difficult. The animals can't speak for themselves, they can't explain how they're feeling. But the objective, I think, should be that within the constraints of the legislation, so not taking into account the suffering of non-experimental animals, the objective should be to assess the totality of the likely negative experience for the animals, you shouldn't be there, for the animals in obtaining the hope for benefit. So including transportation suffering for the animals that are actually used if they are transported, including housing, as well as the whole experience in the experiment, etc. What one should try to do, I think, is to ask what it's like for the animal. Now, obviously, that's difficult. That's not easy. But what it means is that you look for symptoms which basically are about subjective experience rather than objective signs. Now, clearly, objective signs where an animal has a temperature, whether it's circling, indicating stereotypical behaviours. Of course, signs are important, but signs are not the whole story, particularly bearing in mind that many lab animals are prey, and therefore they're genetically programmed, if you like, to mask pain, to mask the showing that they're in pain or the fear, because if an animal shows those symptoms in the wild, then it's more likely to be seized by a predator. The starting point, and this former chief executive, Home Office chief executive said this a few years ago, is what would humans experience in that situation? Now clearly that's not a complete guide, because different animals, including the human animal, are different physiologically and so forth. Sometimes animals will experience less suffering compared to a human being in a particular situation, sometimes more. But the starting point should be what humans would experience, what's sometimes called critical anthropomorphism. The calculation is made even more difficult by the fact that the regulators, the legislation, quite properly requires adverse effects, potential adverse effects to be taken into account, even though they may not happen. So whether there is a risk of something, a hazard essentially means whether there is the intrinsic property means that something could happen. A risk is the chances of it happening and the significance of if it does happen. And okay, I'll move on. The correct approach: cumulative suffering, points of minimising suffering, and the precautionary principle, which is really the risk. Now, I believe that there are licensing problems in practice. The whole system of regulation is very secretive. So these are impressions, but one does get some information from undercover investigations. I've worked on many over the years in this country and abroad. FOI, Freedom of Information request, now producing some licenses from universities, and sometimes one gets a little bit of information from articles as well, but generally not very much. Just run through these quickly. I'm sure Judy will disagree with these, but these are my strong impressions from the evidence that I've seen. The cumulative suffering is not probably taken into account, seen very clearly, I think, from the BUAV's recent undercover investigation at Imperial as well as Cambridge. Psychological distress not always taken into account. Distress from housing confinement not taken into account where it should be. Sometimes just a straight underestimate. It's very, very hard when you read what's the expected symptoms to understand why something has been described as moderate or mild rather than severe or moderate. And I think a big part of the problem is that there's an assumption in making the classification, as there should be, that that care is good, that the intervention will happen, analgesia, and the humane endpoints will be applied. In practice, animal laboratories are not hospitals. You don't have 24-hour care, except in a very few cases. So there simply is no one there on site to intervene promptly when that is required. I can expand on that during question. I think this is a major problem that in the regulation of the system, that severity is based on what is really a fiction, that the care that animals get is first class. There's someone there all the time, and it in cases I've seen, it simply isn't the case. The final example, the final example there is of relative approach in the Cambridge Judicial Review a few years ago. The Home Office were arguing that the substantial category, which is now severe, called severe, was reserved for a small subset. So they operated in effect a quota system. We said, well, that's just wrong. The definition was major departure from an animal's usual state of health well-being. Just ask the question, is what is expected to happen a major departure from an animal's usual state of health well-being? It may not be an easy question to answer. Reasonable scientists may disagree. But that's the question you should be asking, rather than worrying about whether there are experiments which are licensed which cause even more suffering. The High Court and the Court of Appeal agreed with us. I'm going to skip retrospective assessment for now because of Anne-Marie. Just finally, why correct assessment of severity matters? It matters because it may determine whether the licence is needed at all, as to whether you get over the threshold. It matters because the Secretary of State, if she has appreciated the true severity of an experiment, might not license an experiment if, as I said, she appreciated the true severity, so taking everything into account, including psychological distress. It fatally distorts the cost-benefit test. Clearly, if you underestimate or indeed overestimate suffering, or if you underestimate or overestimate benefit, then clearly the cost-benefit test, which is at the very heart, the harm-benefit test, very hard of the legislation, is fatally distorted. The Secretary of State, if she appreciated the true severity, might license in more limited form, for example, only allowing experiment to happen for a certain period of time, not repeated endlessly. She might attach conditions about care, which she might not otherwise attach, and of course it distorts the statistics, which is one of the few information that the public get about animal experiments if suffering is underestimated. So the exercise is difficult, it is right to acknowledge that, but getting it right is crucial given the fact that we have animal experiments, given the fact that there is a utilitarian ethical calculation to be made at the heart of the legislation. It's clearly vital that severity is assessed properly, and the real key to this, in my view, if there is to be public confidence, is far greater transparency, because then the public, animal protection groups, scientists with an interest, alternative groups can make their own assessment as to whether suffering of animals is treated seriously and treated properly or not. Thanks very much for listening.